Hey folks, this is Kalani. With the Shadowlands Alpha open and with the first round of testers already exploring the brand new zone of Bastion, so much extra info is now available for us to delve through. Some very interesting notes were made from Ian's recent interview, which covered way more than I thought it would, but perhaps some of the most exciting info was about gear and how gearing up will change in the Shadowlands expansion. Let's take a closer look at what we now know and why these changes are going to make Shadowlands way better than Battle for Azeroth. The first huge piece of info is that Titanforging and Warforging will not be a thing in Shadowlands whatsoever. I know we don't have the extra item level random bumps right now in Battle for Azeroth. They were ditched in favour of the corruption system for the very last patch. It has been refreshing to say the least. You know exactly what item level you're going to get depending on what content you're running and what difficulty. It's going to be the exact same thing going into the Shadowlands expansion. When you get a piece of gear, it will have a static item level. No random increases, no getting a mythic raiding item level piece of gear from looking for raid, none of that nonsense. Titanforging and Warforging will not be returning from what we know so far. That's the first major win for gearing up in the next expansion. Now I know your next question is probably something about corruption and whether that's continuing in Shadowlands or if we're going to get Shadow Corrupted or Anima Forged or whatever else they might name it. Corrupted effects and items will end with patch 8.3. They are tied to the old gods and that's currently going on in the game right now. They won't return for Shadowlands either, or at least you won't get any new ones at max level, and from what Ian said in the interview, there are no current plans to have any sort of similar system to Titanforging or to corrupted effects pop up in the Shadowlands expansion. I believe he said, "We're just going to let loot be loot again and see where that takes us. Fingers crossed it doesn't bite us in the butt." So no random effects, no random item level increases. When you get your dagger or your mace or your staff from the highest level of current content, that should be it for your gearing up path if that's your best in slot. That's definitely going to be a nice change. Now, with that being said, he did mention that tertiary stats like avoidance, and I'm guessing leech and speed, because they're both tertiary as well, will still pop up on items randomly. The tertiary stats weren't that big of a deal for most players and didn't have a massive impact, with maybe the exception of leech for healers that ended up being more powerful than anyone would believe, and the dev team believes they weren't really part of the problem and why players were complaining about these specific systems and gearing up in general in Battle for Azeroth. I think we could probably still do without avoidance, leech or speed for the most part, but honestly they didn't really change too much unless you were a healer. Sockets are still up in the air, which means at this point the only super important part of an item that could still be random is whether or not it has that socket on it. That's still not super ideal. It would be great if jewel crafters had a bit more to go on rather than just, well, some people might get some sockets someday, so you might sell some gems. If sockets were guaranteed on certain pieces of gear or created using specific profession methods, that would be a lot better than another round of random bonuses on gear. But still, even if sockets remain random, that's kind of the only important factor left in gearing up. Definitely better than the systems stacked on top of systems that we had for gearing in Battle for Azeroth. Now, to counterbalance or offset these changes and to ensure that we don't get absolutely every best in slot piece of gear within a few weeks, the dev team is going to decrease the amount of loot we have access to. It sounds like a huge nerf, but it kind of makes sense. If you look back through the WoW expansions, the amount of loot that we get now is kind of insane. We can use Classic as a direct comparison right now, and while I hope we won't go back to just getting 2 items from each raid boss for a raid of 20 or more players, we get way more loot in BFA when compared to Classic. Significantly more, in fact. And it's not just from raid bosses. We have access to essentially endless loot right now in dungeons. That's never really happened before. We had lockouts for heroic dungeons and lockouts for mythic dungeons when they were first introduced, but the entire system of Mythic Plus kind of prevents a loot lockout. Otherwise, what would be the point in running more dungeons if you couldn't get more loot? But if they're going to reduce the loot across the board, we might also see less loot from Mythic Plus dungeons. I don't think you can lower the loot in dungeons themselves, like normal, heroic and mythic difficulties, 1 item per boss makes sense, and the lockout ensures we can't farm it over and over again. But if you go into Mythic Plus and you do a high enough key, you can get 5 pieces of gear from a single dungeon clear. That's kind of bonkers, so I would also expect to see them reduce the amount of gear you can get from dungeons in one way or another. PvP gear progression might be limited in the same way, but we know that for the most part we will be using Conquest as a currency to actually buy our gear from a vendor again. That's pretty exciting, and I will totally take the trade-off of getting less gear to be able to buy exactly what we want. That will be limited by how much Conquest we can earn in any given week though. I still think getting less gear is going to be fine when you can actually obtain some best in slot gear for once. We won't constantly be chasing that carrot on a stick, you know, the max Titanforge or the best corruption. It's just going to be that piece of gear. So if you get your shiny dagger of Bastion, you've got your shiny dagger of Bastion. It's not going to get any better. That's going to be a nice change. One topic that cropped up to incentivize you to still push your Mythic Plus keys was the idea of giving you a variety of options when you open your weekly Mythic Plus cache. Imagine if you open your box and you are greeted with an option of picking legs, chest, or a weapon. You can pick the slot that you actually need right there and then, and even if it's not a perfect item, you could still end up with a really good upgrade in your slot of choice. Now, we don't know if that's exactly how it's going to work, but they do want to give us a variety of options in the weekly box to make sure we get something at least semi-useful. Ian also said that there might even be a backup option to choose if none of the items on offer are good for you. So maybe we'll see another currency that we can collect from Mythic Plus, or it might just even be anima, whatever that ends up being. If you're given the choice between a helm and gloves and you already have amazing pieces in those slots, this backup option would make sure your weekly cache isn't just completely going to waste. From the way it was described, it sounds like you will earn more options in your weekly Mythic Plus cache by completing and pushing more dungeons. So if the cap for the week is a +10 and that will give you the best item level available in the weekly box, just doing that one +10 key will be enough to populate your chest with a high item level item, but maybe not enough to earn a few extra options to choose from. So if you run 2 or 3 or 4 +10s, you might get that option of another piece to pick, so helm or gloves, or ring or trinket and what have you. That would encourage you to keep running dungeons to give yourself the best possible chance of getting something you need and can make use of. They did mention that they wouldn't go too crazy with it to ensure you didn't ever feel absolutely required to run a silly number of dungeons every week, but it's a possible system that's currently on the table. Another interesting change is that we might see the PvP weekly chest and the dungeon weekly chest combined into one. So doing either activity will give you an item in the chest, and the more you do of each, I guess, probably the more options you'll get when the weekly reset rolls around. We won't be able to test this kind of thing for quite a while, sadly, so it might change by the time we actually get to see it. Something else that cropped up in the discussion was Master Loot and whether we would see the return of dishing out loot en masse at the end of every raid encounter, to which Ian replied rather quickly, no, Master Looter will not return at all. Personal loot is the only option that they're going to consider right now. That's the path they've decided to go down, and they're going to try and make the best of it. He did say that they wanted to provide us with more choice and agency with personal loot, so maybe they'll relax some of the restrictions placed on trading gear with personal loot in Shadowlands. We'll have to wait and see, but no master loot whatsoever. Tier sets have been a bit of a hot topic since they were trashed in BFA as well. No tier sets in BFA was kind of lame, even if we did have a lot of other systems propping up class design. While they haven't totally ruled out tier sets for Shadowlands, we won't see any right at the beginning, so no tier sets in patch 9.0. They might be introduced in later patches to help drive home the whole class fantasy thing that they want to recapture in this expansion, so keep your fingers crossed and we might just see the return of tier sets in some later raids. You may be wondering whether we're going to see similar systems like the Heart of Azeroth Essences, Azerite traits, and the infamous Artifact Power grind. Now the short answer is no. The longer answer is a bit more complicated. For starters, the dev team has said time and time again, and Ian reiterated in this interview, that there are no plans for an artifact power system or anything like it. The grind has finally ended. We still don't know what anima is, but Apparently it's not going to be an AP grind, so I'll just happily accept that. As for the other types of systems, we might see bits and pieces of them, but nothing that could be called a copy and paste. We don't have anything tied to our gear, from what I understand, so that's the big distinction here. Our gear is going to remain our gear. Loot is just loot. Other systems like the soulbinds, the covenant abilities, whatever anima turns out to be, that's all going to be separate. The one system that will start messing around with our gear is the legendary system in Shadowlands. We don't have all the details on this just yet, but we will still be crafting our own legendaries. We can get recipes from a wide variety of content, so in that sense it might be similar to essences, but they did include that any recipe that we obtain will be unlocked across your entire account. So right from the get-go, legendary recipes are going to be account-wide. That's a huge step forward for the altaholics out there. We can craft the base item for the legendary and then add different legendary effects onto them in Torghast at a forge. And then we can also use gems to specify what secondary stats we want the legendary item to have. So we get to pick and choose our own legendary, more or less. This new type of crafting should hopefully be very fun. The choose your own stats thing isn't just for legendaries too. It looks like most crafted gear will have the option to choose your own stats by using gems as an additional crafting item. That could make crafted gear quite powerful. I'm excited to see how that turns out. You may have also noticed from watching the footage of us playing through Bastion that gear is going to look quite different going into the Shadowlands as well. Alongside the level squish, we have another item level squish and stat squish. So we're going back to dealing very little damage. Very big hits right now will crit for above 1k, but we're hitting for hundreds with most spells and abilities at level 50. The template characters that we have access to start with an item level of 75, which is pretty low for what we have right now in BFA. Obviously we're getting knocked down several pegs on the item level chart, but mythic gear from Nyalotha stands at item level 130 on the alpha. Even mythic Eternal Palace gear is item level 100. Normal Eternal Palace gear is item level 78, so that's kind of where our template characters are right now. That means anyone who is geared up even slightly in patch 8.3 and Nyalotha will be more powerful than the template characters, but that's all we have to work with on the alpha right now. Character copy will come at a later date, so we'll get a better idea of how the squish is going to affect the majority of players then. At this gear level, DPS and healers have around 10,000 health at level 50, and tanks have around 17 to 18,000. So quite a big squish once again, but what better time to do this squish than when we're all getting shunted back down to level 50. But that's all I want to talk about regarding gear and gearing up options coming in the Shadowlands expansion. I hope you enjoyed this little preview of Bastion. The zone so far looks absolutely amazing. I can't wait to see what the other 3 major leveling zones look like. What are you most looking forward to about gearing in Shadowlands? How do you feel about the dev team letting loot be loot again and us having practically no random factors to worry about? Leave all your thoughts in the comment section below. If you want to explore the alpha with us, you can join us over at twitch.tv/KalaniTV. I know, a Kalani livestream, how crazy! A big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. You can see their names floating by on screen. If you want to join these lovely guys and gals, you can find a link in the description below. Remember to leave a like just below the video before you leave, and if you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. But apart from that, thanks for watching folks, good luck and have fun, and as always I will see you next time.